All right, it's 25 up. Let's go ahead and start. I know people are still on their way probably. And um, just a bit of a confession. Often when I talk about gender and perhaps trauma as well, it feels like there's a particular level of resistance. Um, I've had hearing aid problems just started today. It won't stay in its little shell thing. We couldn't find the PowerPoint thing. Um, and I'm just particularly nervous. So let me pray for us because it does feel like this is more than um, just speaking jitters or something like that. So let me pray for our time. Lord, you know how significant these categories are for all of us. For those we love, for those we live with, for those we walk alongside in life, for those you've called us to come alongside. We all struggle with this notion of suffering, and we all struggle with both gender and sexuality. And we need both your grace and reassurance and your guidance, um, and an increased sense of the certainty that you provide for us. So, in all we do tonight, I pray for your Spirit to be particularly um, reassuring and um, stabilizing for us, and that one or two sort of grounding points might be solidified for each of us. I know you want this time for all of us to bear fruit for your kingdom. And we ask that your Spirit would not only lead us and teach us, but also protect us. And that you would honor this time and um, my words, Annie's words, our thoughts, and the memories and images you bring to us. We pray for the mechanics of the time, for the PowerPoint and the filming, and the internet, all of that you would protect that as well. And you'd allow us to be present and to trust whatever we've left to come here, that we could give it to you and just relax and be as present as we're capable of being here tonight. We give you this time and thank you for the ways you continue to help us. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. First, a little bit of feedback. I've gotten the question, I think it came up in one of the groups, what happens after level 2? So we've got, remember the last 2 classes are on Thursdays. So 2 weeks from tonight, we're not meeting, we're meeting the next night. And then the last meeting is also that Thursday. So just remember, because of the McLean room schedule, we're bumping to Thursday after tonight. And by the last one, you'll be done with your group. So you've been through 2 groups already, and you got 2 more to go. Um, and so far, what I've heard from the group leaders is it's been um, crammed, like trying to get 2 testimonies in and process that, 2 stories and exercise. It's been, but it's been bonding to some degree. We know it's clunky, that you don't really get a feeling for counseling. It's more like clumsy group counseling, and where you're passing the baton back and forth. And I think I told you at the beginning, but let me remind you, if you're the client, if you get any help, it's a blessing, but don't expect it. You're a guinea pig. Your story is meant to just illustrate, give people a taste of what this is like to actually try to hear someone sharing something they're struggling with, and feel uh, both the weight of it, but also the intrigue, the curiosity, the spirit of just wanting to come alongside and figure out how to be patient and helpful. So after we're done with level 2, if you're in a church that has a lay counseling ministry, or is, and Ryan Zempel is here from National Community Church, or maybe starting a lay counseling ministry, then you have an opportunity to take this and actually, if you're interested, pursue being a lay counselor in the church you're in, if they have that kind of ministry. And you can just talk to us individually about that. I think Open Door, those of you from Open Door, I think the hope is, like National, that we'll resurrect the lay counseling program at some point. McLean has one. I'm not sure what other churches are represented here that have a lay counseling program. But apart from that, this should equip you basically just to be better in relationships. You don't have to call it counseling. You can call it ministry. You can call it just being a much better friend or a much better partner or a much better parent. What you lack, the benefit of being in a lay counseling program is that you get ongoing supervision, ongoing training. And where we used to have 30, 35 churches in the area, now there's 7 churches that really have poured a lot into LCI and have continued the program through COVID and that sort of thing. So the hope is, if you're part of a church that wants to start one, or you could be the catalyst for that, then by all means, talk to us. If you're online, like the folks in DC or Laney in North Carolina, if you have an interest in going somewhere and trying to pitch this for your church, it takes a while to convince churches to believe in lay counseling and that sort of thing. But we're certainly willing to help you figure out what to do next. But there's no official next step. For those of you that are in churches that have lay counseling, if you're interested, the churches typically ask us, you'll get feedback in your last sort of small group. And the churches typically ask, the churches with counseling programs ask us, what was the result of that feedback? And to be blunt, typically what the leaders will do is put you in one of 3 categories. This is not to disturb you, but just be aware. They're either going to say, absolutely, if there's any way for you to use this material, officially, unofficially, we would encourage you to do that. If you're already in a ministry like Grace is in Young Life, you already have a natural place to apply the ministry. If you work with kids or anybody in a ministry setting, 12-step program, anything like that, you have a natural setting to use this. If you're interested in the church, though, you'll either be in the we would highly recommend you, or we would put you in the observe category. Like the church I supervise is Fairfax Community. If you were from that church and your leaders say, I think there's possibility, there's promise here, but I think there's work to be done before I'd give them a client. But we would invite them to participate in the supervision just so they get a feel for what it's like to present cases and get feedback and get it closer to the action. The third category you might be put in is essentially you got work to do. And we couldn't recommend you as a helper because again, this is all pretty subjective and pretty short term, but what was brought up in the group indicates that the best thing we can recommend to you is keep working on your story, your relational style, and seek help, either professional or lay or some kind of program, just so that you feel more equipped in the long run to use this material. Any questions about that? Okay. Just a brief question, and this doesn't have to be in the footage, but because we're talking about gender, it's always helpful in my mind to start with something just intuitive. So I want you to think of an answer to this question, and don't edit. Think of let it be whatever came to your mind first. I feel most like a man or woman when I blank. Any volunteers?
Put on makeup. Put on makeup.
When you put on makeup, okay?
When I feel protected.
Okay.
When I'm with my kids.
When I'm with my kids, okay. And any particular
Little babies.
when they're especially the babies. Okay.
My kids call me on the phone and ask for advice even at an older age.
Okay. All right.
When I snuggle my grandchild.
When you snuggle your grandchild. Okay. Anybody have trouble coming up with an answer? I know you may not want to share it. Yes?
I guess. I mean, I don't know. I guess the first thing that popped in my head was like when I feel strong. I don't know what that means though. Like that was just the first thing he told me not to edit. So
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, sometimes all that comes is a word. It's just a word that we naturally associate. Not unusual. I mean, most of us have grown up, particularly in America, with masculinity being
yeah,
associated with strength. It'd be pretty hard not to have that association.
yeah.
I don't know that there's ever a time I don't feel like I was.
Mhm.
I mean, I think I just sort of feel like like I don't know that anything's particularly stronger.
Okay.
So
That's what the word most then was throwing. I feel most like a woman.
It's
Yeah.
been thrown
Yeah.
me off.
Okay. Well, you're not going to like the second question either.
Good.
I feel least like a man or woman when blank.
When I'm moving furniture. Husband makes me move a lot of furniture.
Because,
It's like a man's job.
Okay.
And I'm not supposed to be that strong, and I am.
yeah,
When I'm bossing people around,
okay,
not children.
okay. That was easier for you to get that answer. Yeah, okay.
So no.
Weird, I love boxing.
Well, I do it a lot, but I don't think people do it.
When my wife looks at me in that particular way of anticipation, like this is your cue.
when you're not ready. Okay, all right. What else? Did you come up with one for this?
I think my honest answer is like overly emotional. I mean, there's reasons. I know exactly why for that, but yeah. So it's like strength and then overly, yeah.
Okay.
I'm starting to get a picture in my head now.
Okay. All right.
I think I know where this comes from.
Okay.
I was thinking emotional or crying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Or is that when I don't know what to do?
Okay. Sort of frozen or just
Feels more age for within gender specific, but
okay. Yeah, that's an interesting sort of add-on there. Right. I think anytime I feel frozen or inadequate or just weak, again, related to the strength and that sort of thing. Anybody else?
Similar, belittled. Like when I feel belittled, I feel like a child. I
Ah,
don't feel like the adult woman that I am.
okay. Again, interesting. You can feel adult, male or female, but you can also feel somehow young and sort of out of whack or whatever. Just like I don't fit in here. I don't belong. Something like that. Okay. The point about asking that is, and you'll see when we talk about our educations, all of us, you realize if this was a class of high school kids or middle school kids, I think the answers would be different. More so now than even 20 years ago. Like we might have been able to predict, when I was in Young Life, I could have predicted what kids would say with a question like that. Because of what's happening in our culture now, because of all the ways that gender identity and gender labels have been sort of thrown up in the air and made it more of a like a free game, plus the lack of trust in gender stereotypes or adult models of masculinity or femininity, then we just have a much more varied cultural landscape now. So that the answer to questions like that, if you guys were a bunch of 15-year-olds, you might get a lot of blank faces, a lot of people just going, I have no idea, like, nor do I particularly care. Or the question doesn't even particularly seem relevant. You're nodding yes, because you work with kids, you would.
I think kids would walk out of the room. There are kids that would say, "I'm offended that you put me in A or B somehow."
because I'm using just the two categories, so to speak. Yeah. And we'll get to that. There's no question. That's part of why I feel like this is a really critical component, not just to counseling, but to parenting, to marriage, to just befriending, to if you're a teacher, if you're involved in any way with younger people, you know that the landscape is so diverse now and so confusing, and that there are so many directions that someone can go in, that it's a lot harder to be very helpful, definitive, let alone anything approaching, and this, I mean this in the best sense of this word, anything approaching authoritative about gender. And there's just not a tolerance for that. So it becomes important in both this subject of gender and trauma, which are the two topics tonight. These are the areas where I feel like counselors and clients we're on a level playing field. Like, there's no way, if you know my story, you know on the second floor of my house, so to speak, there are rooms labeled gender and sexuality and suffering and pain and how I deal with pain that I'm as apprehensive about somebody knowing about as my clients would be. Like, we are all struggling with gender, with sexuality, and with suffering and loss, trauma, threat, that sort of thing. So we know the best thing I can say for you, the reason these topics come up is because they inevitably relate to counseling, either directly or indirectly. Like, gender is always an issue in counseling, the gender of the client and the gender of the counselor. And it's never neutral. It's either helpful or harmful or goes back and forth. And it's worse if you're not, as the person helping, if you're not able to process it. If you can sense that gender issues are in the room between you and the person you're helping, it's helpful to try to gently process that. Because if you don't, the gender tension can make the counseling less effective or less safe. So even if gender is not a part of the presenting problem or a part of the symptom presentation, gender is still a factor. Very simple way to say it. A depressed man is not the same as a depressed woman. It just presents differently. Do they all present the same? No. Depression in men can present a lot of different ways. But there is qualitatively, in my experience, something different, a bunch of different kinds of depressed women. But there is something different when you're talking to a man or a woman about depression or anxiety or loss or intimacy even, or trust. Gender comes into play, even if it's not the presenting issue. And it's just important to be aware of it. In many cases, it's actually important to take advantage of it. I'll give you an example. Well, let me ask you a biblical question here. Have you ever read a story in the Bible and not paid attention to the gender of the characters? Can you think of a story in the Bible where the gender of the characters, Old or New Testament, doesn't seem to matter to you? Anybody? On the other end of the spectrum, can you think of a story where gender clearly is critical to understanding and making sense of, or being touched or moved or affected by the story?
The resurrection account is a really easy one in my mind.
Meaning?
Yeah, because like women's testimony wasn't accepted at the same level at that time. So like the fact that women saw Jesus first.
Yeah, and believed
like,
him. Yeah,
matters to the story.
yeah, it does, absolutely. Anybody else? An example where, yeah, gender really matters to me in this story. Yeah.
Samaritan woman.
Say it again. Yeah, this like the first, yeah. Okay.
Hannah.
Say it again.
Hannah.
Hannah, say more.
Hannah is the mother who can't get pregnant and all that, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A bit of a segue here. the Bible's interesting in that there's not a lot of direct teaching about gender. And you'll see when we'll talk about the Bible and gender in a minute here. But I think the Bible is full of hints, innuendo, suggestions, illustrations, like a whole bunch of illustrations about good and bad women and men. And those hints, those sorts of clues, those breadcrumbs can be processed humbly. I don't think authoritatively, and that's part of my pitch for tonight. In both gender and trauma, the most important thing we can be as helpers is humble and gutsy. Let me give you a couple examples of what I mean that the Bible has a lot to indirectly say about gender. This is out of Proverbs in chapter 30. The leech has two daughters, give and give. Three things are never satisfied, four never say enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. Three things are too wonderful for me, four I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a virgin. Under three things the earth trembles, under four it cannot bear up. Now this is the most intriguing one to me in this chapter. A slave when he becomes king. A fool when he's filled with food. An unloved woman when she gets a husband. And a maidservant when she displaces her mistress. Now, I don't know what you do with that passage, but here's my paraphrase. There are four phenomena in the world that Solomon is saying, this is really significant in terms of impact. Like something powerful is going on in these four things. Something that is not the way it's supposed to be. When a slave becomes a king, that's a radical switch. When the political world is turned upside down. A fool when he's filled with food. Now that one, I'm not sure what that means other than if some of your desires have been met and you feel unleashed in a foolish way, what might you do? It would make more sense, a fool filled with wine would make more sense. But there's something here that's talking about when somebody is foolish and not hungry. Now that's metaphorical. Then it enables a fool to do more foolish things instead of just trying to get their needs met. That's part of the implication. An unloved woman when she is married. Now these two make more sense to me, but that's because I'm thinking about gender. Like what happens? All of us know women in this category. What happens when you're married and not loved? And what that does to the soul of a woman. Notice, Solomon makes a lot of gender distinctions in Proverbs. Like, the leech has two daughters. Why did you say two daughters instead of two sons? Now, most of the time, Solomon's pretty positive about women and pretty negative about men. But there are passages where he uses a woman in a negative sense. Now, this last one, the earth trembles when a mistress replaces the wife. That's the implication. So this is a commentary on how adultery or being traded for a different model affects the soul of a woman. Again, it's making a subtle innuendo that that's different, that a man being replaced by the pool guy is not the same as a woman being replaced by the nanny. And it's a hint at, is there something different in the makeup or structure or wiring of a woman? That's not clear authoritative teaching. In fact, many of the stories in here, there's just hints of something. That's why all the stories in the gospel, you've heard me say it several times, because women are really, I think Jesus treats women differently, and women respond to him differently. And there's a connection there that I don't think we see, in particular with the male disciples, John possibly being an exception. But that has to do with the gender of the parties involved. So Jesus being a man, and Mary Magdalene, his mother, Mary and Martha, the Samaritan woman, the Syrophoenician woman, these are women responding not just to the Messiah, the rabbi, but they're responding to a man. And there's something life-changing there, which is different than the men responding to the man, rabbi, Messiah, Jesus. There's just something different there. And you have to decide. I'm really suggesting that your theology of gender should be one of the things that is constantly just being processed and reworked, not hardened, not rigid. The worst thing we can be, particularly in counseling around gender issues, particularly in today's culture, is to be rigid or dogmatic. The scriptures also seem to be a bit odd here in that there's really a lot of hard stories about men and women. There's a lot of rough marriages. Think of Hosea and Gomer, even Abraham and Sarah, Samson and Delilah, David and Michal, Bathsheba, even Abigail, and let alone the curse on David that your sons will sleep in public with your wife. Like, you read the Old Testament and the relationships there between women, it's rough. It's rough terrain. It's rough to get positive imagery or positive theology. Only that the Bible as a historical record, as a collection of stories, is saying it's really tough to be a man or a woman and navigate it well. My own personal, one of 1,000 questions, but at some point in heaven, I would like to ask, God, you gave us one bedroom story of a man and a woman, where we got to eavesdrop on a communication between a man and a woman. And you picked arguably the most evil woman in the Old Testament and an equally evil husband. This is Ahab and Jezebel in Kings. And what we get is a very intimate conversation in 1 Kings 21 between a man and a woman, where he's whining about the vineyard that he can't get on his own, and she's frustrated with his weakness and dominates the thing and controls the situation and says, I'll fix it. And you can imagine him in parentheses, you wimp. And she goes and deals with it and has Naboth killed and comes back and says, here's your vineyard that you wanted so bad. Now, why God chose to give us, he's eavesdropping on every husband and wife that's ever lived. Why did you record that one? Why didn't we have a recording of Priscilla and Aquila? Or one of the couples that we hope was a better model of marriage? Why do we have so many hard examples of men and women trying to make the relationship work? Which to me, it's an interesting question. And at least part of this, same thing when we get to trauma, because you'll see what I'm going to say, the Bible is really trauma rich. It's also, and what I'm saying is, it's also gender difficulty rich. It's gender warning rich. And part of that, you have to go, wow, this is supposed to be the manual for living, but what we're getting is a lot of what not to do or who not to be. You are getting an idea of how difficult it is to be in a marriage that is what we would now, using the one reference in Corinthians, that we would say now is an equally yoked man and woman together, where it's a marriage that you go, that's a marriage I can enjoy or respect. All of us who are married know that's a hard thing. You can get there. You can feel like there are times where it's good, but we all know it's difficult because this is an area where sin, the effects of the fall, and the curses around the fall, gender was profoundly affected. One more commentary in the Bible. This is in the manual. I'm just going to read it because I think it's helpful. Genesis 2, this is on page 5-6. Genesis 2 is considered important because it's the only pre-fall data that we have about God's intention regarding gender, marriage, and one flesh or sex. So of all the categories we're talking about here, this is a category where we have a little bit of information about God's original design. This data is bookended with the picture painted of gender, marriage, and maybe, possibly, sex in heaven, which is the only post-fall data we have. In other words, it seems God had an original idea or design before Genesis 3, a final idea or design, which will be what we experience in heaven, where we will be perfected. And gender is a part of heaven. Like, we don't lose gender. And that's a significant thing. We lose the suffering. We lose the trauma. We lose the resistance and the self-serving behavior. But we don't lose the gender. So it seems God had an original design, a final design, and an in-between design or idea. And what that means is God knew, because he knew the fall was going to take place, and he knew because of what we read in Genesis 3, that the consequences that are given to Adam and Eve seem significant to me. With Eve, when he says, because you listened to the serpent, two things will be true for you. You're going to have pain in childbirth, and you're going to want to rule your husband. Simple commentary here. You don't have to be married or be a mother to feel those consequences. They're not reserved only for married women or pregnant women. The point here, this is my take, because the woman was primarily designed for relationship. You'll hear Annie talk a little bit later about superpower. I think the superpower given to women is this ability to relate in a way that far surpasses a man's capacity to relate and to give. And what he's saying is, because you chose to follow or listen or trust or believe the serpent, your ability to relate is going to be, your desire to be in these intimate relationships is going to be frustrated. In other words, my translation of what Genesis 3 says is, women, because being known and loved and in relationship is the most important thing, you are going to struggle with disappointment the rest of your life in relationships that matter, whether you're pregnant or not. If you don't have children, you'll battle disappointment. If you do have children, you'll battle disappointment. If you're married, you'll battle disappointment. If you're not married, you'll battle disappointment. That's a very loose translation of, is this how gender gets affected? And does that mean, okay, every woman from Eve on, we start from a deficit because of what happened in Genesis 3, where I'm wired to be in intimate, extravagant, loving, giving relationships, where I am known and feel valued and safe and can give freely of myself. And I'm going to be frustrated. And one of the ways I'm going to deal with that disappointment is to try to control things. Which is why we have lots of stereotypes of women who are either very controlling or very depressed, very shut down, or trying to attach somewhere else. Not necessarily illicitly, but attached to ministry, to other women, to the church. But I've got to do something with my frustrated longing to be in intimate relationships. That's how I read Genesis 3. Now, that's a very gender-specific read. What happens to man, this is where, and I think God is pretty harsh here. He says, look, because you, and Larry Crabb wrote a book called The Silence of Adam, where he says, look, there are many sins that took place before Adam ate the fruit. One of them was Adam's passivity. The reason he titled the book The Silence of Adam, because the scriptures are pretty clear. Adam was standing right next to Eve when this whole conversation with the serpent was taking place. And he said nothing. You said you feel like a woman when you feel protected. Or somebody did. Yeah. And what's happening here, in watching this creature seduce his wife and lead his wife to reconsider the command God gave that you directly heard. We don't know if Eve ever directly heard it from God, but you said nothing. And that passivity, that silence, set the whole thing in motion. Like, if you could wind the clock back, Adam, what would you do differently? I would have spoken up. I would have said, Eve, don't. You remember what God said. And we don't know who this being is. And we know we can trust God. We don't know who this is. I would have said something instead of being passive. And the consequence then becomes for Adam, one of them is very direct. Because of you, the ground is actually cursed. Which then means it's your job to sort of govern and provide and rule on the earth. And now you're going to get resistance. And now you're going to struggle with being adequate at what you're called to do. And because of what I said to Eve, you're going to go home to a woman who wants to rule over you. Or, said a different way, to a woman who's disappointed in you. So for a man, you're going to, the result of the fall is you're going to fundamentally deal with a sense of weakness and inadequacy. And not knowing how to pull off what you're supposed to pull off. And the woman is going to feel an increased level of insecurity or a lack of respect or a lack of responsiveness to that. And that's just the hand we're dealt because of what happened in Genesis 3. And I can tell you that if you remember when we did the dignity and depravity, there's a tendency to, like, we're capable of loving God and relating to God and being close to God, but because of sin, we have a tendency to be detached from God and distrust God and that sort of thing. You can take the idea of a man or a woman and you can see the same thing. If I'm operating out of dignity, what am I like? If I'm operating out of depravity, what am I like? And it's just not hard I know when I'm operating out of weakness and fear and shame and inadequacy. I can be passive, I can be angry, I can avoid anything that makes me feel inadequate and only do things I'm good at. I can blame shift. I can do a lot of things out of that sense of weakness, that I can't be who I'm called to be. And my wife, if she's operating out of that disappointment is ruling her, not her sense of trusting in God and being faithful and courageous and believing in the possibility that there's always hope for something better, then you can be angry, bitchy, controlling, depressed. You can focus on other things. You can have other kinds of symptoms because I have to do something to lessen the feeling of disappointment that I feel. And if you put those things together, where this is the man I want to be, and this is the woman, if my wife's over here, this is the woman she wants to be, but I'm behaving like a man that she has a hard time trusting or respecting or feeling connected to or close to, it's going to pull her down. And if she's operating down here, it's going to make me, it's only going to trigger more of a reaction in me. Does that make sense? This is part of the hand that we're dealt from Genesis 3, that we come into this world with gender identity and gender behavior and gender success or maturity being an uphill struggle. Like and this side of heaven, we're not going to be delivered, which is why we're always chasing. That's why there are so many books about you name it. That's why there's so much being sold online, because we're chasing something that's rooted in this. I can't be who I was designed to be. We can't be what marriage was designed to be. And that's a part of, you can see where the broken and sort of fractured gender piece is always going to play a part in whatever symptoms or presenting problems that people bring to counseling. That's why I said a depressed man is different than a depressed woman. If I'd asked you the question, as a man or a woman, what are you most afraid of? Again, we would get, I don't know that we get a completely separate set of answers, but you can imagine there would still be a leaning from the women in the room and the men in the room in terms of what we're really afraid of. Where do we, it relates to where I feel least like a man or a woman, because that's all of that's getting at the brokenness that's in the gender. And I really think God is trying to be sort of very honest with us about the consequences of the fall and the need for us to be in relationships that help us accept what is and find the courage and faith to move forward against what our fallen nature is telling us to do. And we just need help not giving in to the disappointment or the passivity. Like we have a sense of, I don't have to handle this like all these people in the scriptures did. But it's also at the same time giving us a real picture of God's grace, because he uses so many of those people. Samson gets used, David gets used, Bathsheba gets used. I mean, the prostitutes get used, Esther gets used. And again, it feels to me like there are a lot more clean stories about women than men, to be honest. There are only a few men that I think get in the Hall of Fame. I think there's, percentage-wise, there's a lot more women that get in the Hall of Fame, in my mind. This is just, I'm a bit biased here. But almost everybody, particularly in the Old Testament, who's a man, that there's a dark side to them. Daniel is an exception. Maybe Elisha's an exception. There are a couple exceptions, but for the most part, we see the good and the bad in those people. And this is part of God saying, I get it. It's an uphill battle. It's hard. That's part of what happened in Genesis 3. And part of it is it requires us to be more dependent on him. I'm going to tell you a story. I'll come back to this one. This is a client called Preston. And if you remember the genogram, Preston grew up in the South and had an older brother and older sister. And his dad was blue collar. And he would have said in a word, my dad was just an angry trucker. And my brother was a bully and a jock, and was particularly unkind to both Preston's sister and to him. And there was a lot of tension here, and these two were very close. So Preston grew up in a home where the two men that he was exposed to, he did not like, enjoy, or respect. In the meantime, his mom had a circle of friends here in the South. I forget what, and they would meet regularly once a week for, I don't know if they played bunco or bingo, whatever that game is. I don't know what they played, but they had coffee and that sort of thing. And Preston, early on at a young age, became the mascot of that group of women. So he would serve the coffee and the cakes or biscuits or whatever, and the women would fawn over him, and he felt very safe and very known and very valued with his mom and with her friends. And he felt very unsafe and unvalued with the two men in his life. His sister, interestingly enough, ran away at 16. So her response to this drama was, I'm out of here. When I saw Preston, he was 40. And he told me two stories that I'm going to tell you to give you an idea of what's happening here, what leads to the gender confusion that Preston comes to counseling for. He tells me this story, and even as he's telling me about being this mascot, he's beaming. Like, this is a really sweet, precious story. Like, my life worked when these women came over. My mom, I felt connected to my mom, and she loved that these women responded to me and that I felt valued here. He said, one day I was like 10 years old, and I was up in the attic, and I didn't know my mom was coming home. And I was up in the attic, and I'd opened a trunk that had a bunch of my mom's clothes in it. And I was actually trying on my mom's dresses in front of a mirror up in the attic. And at some point I turned around and my mom had climbed up the attic stairs and her head was peeking over the floor and watching me try on dresses in front of the mirror. And he said I was panicky about what her response would be. If you were Preston's mom and you come up the attic stairs and see your 10-year-old son trying on your dresses that were in your trunk in the attic, what do you think your reaction would be? I'll tell you my reaction when I came home and my 4-year-old son, Adam, was dressed in white leotards and a white turtleneck with an Aladdin sword, was in our basement with Mikhail Baryshnikov's The Nutcracker on a DVR, and he was dancing the part of Baryshnikov and fighting the Mouse King and trying to copy all of the ballet moves. I got home from school and Debbie said, be very quiet and go down and watch what Adam's doing. It's really cool. So I'm like, I get all excited. I go down the stairs and I see my 4-year-old son trying to do ballet and dressed in white leotards and a white turtleneck with a sword and trying to fight a Mouse King and jumping off the couch and everything like that. And I can tell you, everything in me went ballistic. Doesn't matter what I teach here. When I saw my 4-year-old son, primitive ideas of masculinity and fears about what would happen if he did this gripped me. Fortunately, I didn't say anything to Adam. I don't even know if he saw me come down. But I went back upstairs to Debbie, and I was not happy. And she was like, whoa, champ. First, she was like, did you say something to him? Like, you better not have said something. And I said, no, but I want to. And she was like, you're an idiot. Do you realize, what are you so afraid of? And I just blurted it out because we had seen Billy. I'm afraid he's going to be in ballet and he's going to be gay and I'm going to live with his son. I have to deal with all kinds of stuff. That, in parentheses, I have no idea how to handle. You see the inadequacy? But the inadequacy gets turned into anger. And I want to blame somebody. Like, who put him up? And she was like, my wife was so fast and so smart. She goes, isn't there a wide receiver for the Chicago Bears that does ballet just to get in shape for the season? I said, yes. And she said, so it's a really athletic thing, you know, ballet? Yes. And exactly, are you worried about? I blurted it out. It's like, you know, you got to be, that's just your stuff. That's what she's saying. That's your baggage there. So I know what it's like to be controlled by your early learnings about gender and gender stereotypes and the fear that we have about that. And she said, if we had a daughter and she was downstairs building something, like with a hammer and nails, would you have been equally frustrated or terrified with her? And he said, of course not. She goes, little double standard there. Like, well, yes. You know, it's like, so I imagine myself being Preston's mom and walking up the stairs and seeing my son trying on dresses, and I think I would do exactly what I did with Adam. Preston's mom came all the way up the stairs in the attic and sat down and said, what are you doing? I'm trying on the dresses. She said, well, try this one on. So she didn't react. She didn't freak out. Now, you can imagine, so he's showing up at age 40 because he's a cross-dresser? No. He's showing up at age 40 because his gender identity has really been turned upside down, and he doesn't know how to identify himself. The second story he tells me is that he's a freshman in college, and he discovers gay porn, and for the first time, something connects in his head, and he starts feeling a connection to the gay porn. As we talk over the year about why was that such a powerful connection for you? He said, I didn't think I was gay, but when I saw the gay porn, it clicked. Something clicked in me. Like I felt something, a piece fell in place there. And then that began a history of thinking, how do I deal with being an evangelical Christian and what he would identify as a gay man, thinking that's what I want as a gay relationship. And it was only through working that he began to understand, okay, my reaction goes all the way back to the beginning of my gender identity, and it made me vulnerable to something that solved a bit of that identity problem and gave me a way to be to seek masculinity that I wanted and could connect to via a sexual connection. So let me illustrate what I mean. In the manual, you'll see there's a very simplistic model that Dr. Crabb uses for gender identity. And he says from zero to 1, a kid has no idea that there is a boy or a girl. They're not aware of gender differences at all. But from 1 to 4, now you've got little kids that are beginning to realize, oh, there are boys and girls and I'm one of them. And you have the cute, funny, sometimes uncomfortable conversations where the sister says, I don't have a penis. Well, how come I don't have a penis? Or I want a penis. Or the boy is thinking, I like playing with dolls or dresses. Why can't I do that? I don't understand. Like, I know we're different, but I like what you're doing, or I don't like what you're doing, or dad wants me to do this, but I want to do what you do. You get all that confusion. But the beginning of gender identity is simply realizing there's 2 genders. And anatomically, you're one of the 2, right? Somewhere between 4 and 10, you begin, in Crabb's mind, you begin to ask the question, not out loud and not consciously, but am I glad that I'm a boy or a girl? Do I like the gender I've been anatomically assigned? Now here's where Preston's story comes in, because between 4 and 10, the only 2 males in his life he did not like at all. And so in his young brain, he's saying, I don't like my gender. I know I am that gender, but I don't like that gender because of what I've been exposed to with regard to my gender. So I'm not glad that I'm a boy. And I feel much safer with females than I do with males. Crab would say now, probably from 7 to who knows what, the second question we ask is, am I good at it? So not only I'm young and I realize I'm a boy. At some point, I'm unconsciously asking the question, am I glad I'm a boy? Or am I unsure if I like being a boy? Now you can see where the culture is making this, is running wild with this simple concept. Because the minute you say you don't have to be a boy or a girl, now any kind of sense of dislike means you can go back to the drawing board. You can go back to the deck and deal something different. Because we've defined gender as a cultural phenomena, not an internal reality. Now you've got people can say, well, I don't like it. I can change who I am and redefine my gender identity. But for most of us growing up, that wasn't the cultural option. But we certainly could have said, do I like it or not? And maybe as young as 5, you could also have said, I'm good at it or I'm not good at it. Like I think, I don't know, I was an elementary ed major. I think if you'd gone into a kindergarten class in the 80s and asked 20 kids in a kindergarten class, who are the coolest boys and girls in this classroom? They'd all have an answer. In other words, they can discern in their mind who are the ones that are good at being boys or girls. And if you asked why, you'd get pretty immature answers like, well, because everybody wants to sit with them at lunch or invite them to their party, or they run fast, or they're funny, or they're tall, or they're pretty, or they have the newest whatever. So their reasons are pretty societal or shallow, but they have a sense of who's successful or who isn't successful. So we're already aware, without trying to be, of some kind of pecking order here. And so gender confusion, gender identity confusion, begins pretty early, where if you don't like what your gender is, or you don't think you're good at your gender, now you've got a dilemma. Now you've got a road in front of you that feels uphill, that feels like it's going to be rife with challenges. I don't know how to be, in a sense, simplistically comfortable in my own skin. And I don't feel like I have a chance of being successful in the gender category that I'm in. So gender identity starts very basically. Once you get, and now probably once you get to 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th grade, Dr. Crab would say, now all of a sudden you realize it's a lot more complicated to be good at being male or female. Once puberty kicks in, again, it's more complicated. And you realize having a healthy, positive gender identity in our culture is really difficult, which is why gender identity and how we feel about ourselves as men and women is always checkered. It's always mixed. So hearing Preston's story, I hope you can see this is a kid who's just trying to figure out, what do I do with the hand I've been dealt? And I'm a boy, but I'm in a family with 2 males that I really dislike intensely and feel bullied by. And I definitely don't want to be like them. So what other option do I have? Where do I feel safe? It's with these older women. But I don't identify as a woman. Preston had been born in 2015. I don't know, maybe he'd be, because the culture might say, well, you can start to identify as a she, her if you choose to. But when he was growing up, that wasn't an option. But what you end up with is a gender confusion in his identity. And then he's trying to find some way to deal with the sexual hormones that are kicking up and this gender identity problem. And now you latch onto gay porn, and you've got a sexual addiction that's scratching the itch to discover something about sexuality and get release in the sexual arena, coupled with this gender identity confusion. And you have somebody coming in that's really unhappy with his life. Still very devoted to Christianity, but really uncomfortable being in the evangelical church because it's no man's land for him. And I don't know how to get out of the situation that I'm in. And I'm only presenting that case so you understand how something like gender identity or gender confusion can then get coupled with certain behaviors or certain routines, and then that can create a collection of symptoms that would bring somebody into counseling, like I can't make my life, I can't make it work. And now I'm sort of trapped in this addiction as well. And I've been feeding a belief that what I would really like is to be, I think what I want is to be married to a man, but everything in me spiritually says that's not a healthy option for me. And I'm not sure that's really what I want. Because at some point he said, I feel like I'm sort of stuck at 13. I'm 40, but I feel developmentally stuck at 13. So he would have said, I'm nowhere near ready to get married. At one point he was dating, and he told her all of this stuff, and she was willing to marry him anyway, and say, we'll make it work, which has happened on many cases. There are lots of pretty well-known cases of gay Christians who've married a heterosexual partner and have kids and an ongoing life, and they just, their sexual orientation just gets sort of put in a closet, or it's a real thing, but you don't feed it, and so it doesn't dominate or take over that much. But he realized, he said, I was almost willing to go forward until she just asked me to kiss her, and I couldn't. And he just thought, I can't do that to her. That's not fair to her. And he was like, I was actually repulsed by the idea. And so that would not, and he was kind enough to her to say, I just don't think it's fair to you. But all right, just an example of how understanding gender and gender identity plays into, before you want to hear the story as it unplays or plays out, and try to see how the gender dots get connected in someone's story. This is in the manual, but it's worth repeating in 5 minutes left. I do think it's important to realize that our education in terms of gender begins with the wiring or the hand we're dealt. And then, so that's our nature. And then it begins, or the next step is the environment we're placed in. So every family creates a gendered environment and a sexual environment. Some are healthy, some are not. But like Preston, you can get it, his environment gave him very negative pictures of masculinity. But everybody's environment gives them data, gives them models and imagery about gender. And there's also language, things that are spoken directly, indirectly, just comments about people in the media, people on TV and movies and that sort of thing. At some point, second big environment, and often now we can see this is actually bleeding in pretty early. Now we have the larger environment educating us as well about gender and gender characteristics and identities. At some point, we begin to have experience of our own. And now at this point, there's more agency involved in that. So now we're not just learning from watching and absorbing, now we're learning by experimenting. And we're making, consciously or unconsciously, we're making decisions about how I feel about myself as a man, or how I relate to men and women, and what I do with my attraction or lack of attraction, what I do with my emotions, all that sort of thing. At some point, we may get some kind of formal education, whether it's the family life classes in elementary school, or your Dobson weekend with your preteen kids or whatever, but you're getting some kind of education. For most of us, the last piece of information we get when it comes to understanding gender is what the scripture has to say. So what we would call is the most helpful truth, is the thing that comes last in our development. This is why when I saw my son dancing, my reaction was primitive. It was based on sort of the early training. That's what gets wired deeply. This is similar to trauma, that what gets wired first and most deeply is what kicks in when you're under stress or when you feel threat or confusion or something like that. Also, we won't get into this, most of us have an arousal history. And if you're dealing with somebody with sexual problems, which most of you probably won't be, but if you were, if they can begin to unfold that arousal history, and it's just an interesting fact that early sexual arousal memories, if you think of our brains as like file cabinets, those early arousal events go in first in the file cabinet even before we know that there is such a thing as sex. So if you were molested at age 3 and you're not even, but that goes in, you don't even know it's an arousal event for somebody until later you learn that, but that event goes in early in the file cabinet, and whatever's in there early has an inordinate weight on the beliefs that come to fruition later. So early memories, early arousal events can really have a profound shape or effect on the trajectory of someone's sexual behavior, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Also, in the same way, I don't mean to underplay this, anytime we have positive experiences, anytime that we actually discover things that we really love, that we delight in, that feel like this is great. Like when you first fall in love, your first significant other, that there's a period of time where it feels like this is really working, and like it's the beginning of a faith that I could actually be in a relationship with someone, or the discovery of the way how pleasure works and how arousal works, that sort of thing. All of there's a positive history that's taking place. All of us, in that sense, we have positive experiences in terms of gender identity and sexual behavior, and we have negative experiences. And both are educational. I mean, the problem, just like when we get to trauma, is that often the negative tends to have more of a significant weight. Okay. Boy, that time went quickly. Let me see if there's anything else that. No, let me just pause there. And I think what we're going to do, just because that, for whatever reason, what I prayed before, a lot of that was ad-libbing, not what's in the content. So I may film more with Denver to get you more of the actual content than a lot of what you just heard. So just keep that in mind, and we'll let you know once we film that. Let's take a 5-minute break and we'll switch gears. All right, let's go ahead and start. This is a brief video. It's called the Still Face Experiment, which, if you're familiar with Curt Thompson, it's mentioned in his book, Anatomy of the Soul. And it's just a good intro into this topic of suffering.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So we're all familiar with this. And again, part of this is be aware that we're shaped by the suffering we've been through, and we're shaped by our own sort of answers to the questions about the purpose of suffering and where is God and what's he up to and when and how does he answer prayer, or does he, and how do we make sense of this with what's happening in the world. So we have our own theology and our own stories of suffering that have shaped some of our beliefs and some of our reactions to when we see things that feel like suffering or unjust or feel hurtful. So that we just need to be aware that this is where humility again is a piece of working with this, and a sense of grace and kindness when you're dealing with the effects, the long-term effects of people that have been through any kind of prolonged kind of suffering. So understanding trauma, again, not everybody reports to counseling because they have something they would label trauma. People's definitions of trauma can really vary. So you have to be, like anything, when someone's telling you I have a traumatic past or I don't have a traumatic past, you don't know how they define those words. In my intake form, that's one of the direct questions. Was there trauma in your childhood? And not surprisingly, there's a gender difference in the answers on all of my intake forms. Women are much more likely to write yes than men to that question. Lots of times people would say, I don't think so, which indicates I don't know whether there was trauma or not, but then they have to describe their mother and father and something of their family growing up. And part of this just means because we've all got very personalized definitions of the word trauma or suffering or abuse or neglect or any of the other categories of trauma. So you just want to go in with a sense of openness without, one of the books I'm going to recommend at the end is Allender's latest version of The Wounded Heart, which is called Healing the Wounded Heart, which came out 25 years after the original, and has a wonderful chapter on caring for someone's story. And you'll see a little bit of a reference for that in the slideshow. But it's just important to not give superficial spiritual answers when people are talking about trauma or loss or tragedy or suffering. So you want to be patient with the process and a lot of the, for believers anyway, the spiritual questions, even for non-believers, the problem of evil and the problem with suffering. So you want to, because we're all still battling that as well. So you want to be gracious and patient before trying to offer spiritual sort of truths or band-aids or helps prematurely. In front of you, I've given you just one sample of a trauma symptom checklist. This is one I did a research paper comparing male and female survivors of sexual abuse in the 80s for my master's degree. And I used an earlier version of this trauma symptom checklist. I've used it actually with quite a few clients because it takes about 5 minutes to fill out. If what you get here is the therapist version, which has the code up above, so it tells you which questions indicate potential issues or disorders in certain categories. One of the things tucked into this, you'll see the fourth one, sexual abuse trauma index. Now, when you give it to a client, that's not on there. All they have is the part that begins right here. You just fill this out, either 0, 1, 2, 3. But when you're grading it, you're adding up the numbers for, on that one, you know, it looks like there's 8 numbers, so you take those numbers, and there's a cutoff there, where if the number is higher than a certain number, it just means to the therapist, keep in mind there may be some kind of trauma related to sexuality because of their answers to those questions. I just wanted to give you a feel that there are tools that, in terms of assessment, that can help get some information out. Sometimes people are a lot more willing to fill out information on paper than saying anything verbal. The research I did had 80 participants, and they all filled out pretty intense 6-page assessments of their sexual abuse with pretty, I'm not sure it would be a wise thing to do now because of what we've learned about trauma, but I was shocked at how willing people were to be open on paper as part of a research project. And it's not what I find when you're verbally talking to someone. Yeah.
Sorry, you said what you know about sexual trauma now.
Yeah, just that.
Is not good without
Because a survey is very invasive. It's very, you know, it's not personal, so it's not a person asking you those questions, but it is really saying things like, you know, was there pain? Were you forced to comply? Were you forced to get other people involved? There's a lot of, you know, intimate kinds of questions, plus you have to rate yourself on a number of categories. And for a lot of people, they would report this was a really hard thing to fill out. It was a hard survey to fill out. And I think we understand better now that pushing for information is not a wise tactic. Again, it's different if you're volunteering to participate in a study. It suggests you're willing to talk about the trauma and look at it at least from an objective difference. That's not the same as working on your story. But for the data, to get a handle on the data, it was important for people to give that information. And it'll come in one of the stories tonight. Not hard to see that the scripture is full of trauma. Even in the book of Genesis, there's a string of traumas that happen one after the other. You can't read in the scriptures and not see God reporting suffering, trauma, tragedies, calamities, captivities, just the consequences of certain people's behavior. It's just hard, and you have to ask the question, again, like the gender thing, what's the point? Why is so much of the scripture telling us about what's hard in life? Why is so much of the interaction between God and his people also like, in some ways, Holocaust-like dramatic? Like I remember when my younger son was a kid, his room was decorated with Noah's Ark, and we had a book that had wood prints of Noah's Ark. And in one of the pictures, there's a picture of the ark with Noah on the ark and the animal, one or two of the animals and stuff. And in the water, there's a half a dozen humans going like this. And of course, my son goes, "Daddy, who are those people?" And boy, I didn't say this, but what I wanted to say, because I'm a twisted dad, what I wanted to say was, well, those are all the people that God was killing because they're evil. And this is actually the first Holocaust, Alex. Now, of course, I didn't say that. He's 3. But looking at the picture genuinely made me think, this is horrific. And this little simple wood print showed it just in a brief way, and it makes you aware. I mean, God reports a lot of trauma that's the result of human behavior, evil behavior, the enemy, but a lot of it's his consequences as well. And we have to wrestle with the question, God, what's the point here? And one way to talk about that, this is what if we don't pay attention to suffering and trauma, if we're not willing to be students of trauma and suffering, this is a bit simplified, but we're either going to live our life terrified of suffering and judgmental about suffering, including judgmental of God. So it just becomes important. We know this already. The scriptures make it pretty clear. One of the reasons there's so much trauma is because we're fallen people in a fallen world with an enemy. What's less clear, and Annie will talk a little bit about this as well, is that God has designed the human brain with remarkable capacity for resilience, for adaptation, for self-protection, for coping with significant. Carrie, you okay? Do you want to stay? Would you like to go? What do you need? That's fine. You can catch this later. Yeah. The resilience of children and the ability to cope with trauma, including with very, what we would call very primitive defense mechanisms in order to endure both environmental trauma, like ongoing trauma, or events of trauma. Like God has really equipped us with a fascinating brain that can keep moving and keep finding a way to exist, even though we're suffering trauma. Back to the beginning. Every one of us at some point has been hurt. And I'm just using the example of falling. Like at some point we realize the world isn't safe. The world isn't ideal. It isn't what I thought it would be or wanted it to be. Some kids never have that chance. They come into the world and they're suffering from the NICU unit that they're in, or the family that they're in, or the adoption agency, or the orphanage that they're in. I mean, some kids have no memory of having a life that seemed pretty safe until it wasn't. But all of us realize some point in life we have been hurt, and I'm just using the imagery of falling. But I'm also indicating it's one thing to fall off a curb. It's another thing to fall off a fence, a whole other thing to fall off a cliff. And the point is, we all have experienced pain, but at the degree of pain, the intensity of the pain, the circumstances of the pain, and the response of others. Like other things matter too. Was I pushed? Was I helped? Was I blamed? Was I left alone in my pain? Did somebody help me make sense of it? Was it repetitive? Do I know why it happened or why it continued to happen? Those are all questions that we are naturally, once we begin to discover that we can be hurt, that suffering exists, our brain is naturally trying to make sense of the suffering and trauma. But we're trying to make sense of it with whatever age our brain is. My, pardon?
You said brain. but
Yeah.
not your physical.
Say it again.
You said your brain. Your brain's age, not your physical age. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure I heard
Yeah.
that correctly.
Well, and I don't mean that it's not just the brain, it's the brain, because the body's, like one of the books we'll recommend is The Body Keeps the Score. The body actually has a more accurate memory of what happens to us. And so at times our brain is actually separated into our sort of cognitive upper level brain, but we also have a more primitive brain that's associated, much more attached to our body. And then we have a brain that's called the mammalian brain that's connected to our emotions. So, and those at times it's called there's a slide for this, but the human brain in that sense, it has this sense where this is the lower brain, what's called the reptilian brain. This is the fight, flight, or freeze brain. This is the reactive brain. This is the arousal brain. This is the fastest reaction to anything, to hurt or suffering or calamity. Then we've got in the middle what's called the dog brain or the mammalian brain. That's where our emotions and also our loyalties and our attachments, our basic attachments. And I think they use dogs because we're all aware that dogs are very attachment oriented and very loyal in that sense. So we've got a part of our brain that responds to hurt, trying to make sense of it relationally and emotionally. And then we've got the cerebral cortex, which is the slowest thing to respond to pain or suffering or trauma, which is where we're trying to make sense of things. So when bad things happen, it's said that it goes from the bottom up. In other words, we're dealing with it first in our body and our instincts, and then in our relationship and our emotions. And it takes time for the cerebral cortex to actually get online to help us make sense of something. And this is where, and you'll see a brief story about disclosure. If we have help up here processing what's happening to us, it can really change the effects of trauma. If we're left alone to try and make sense of trauma, particularly with a child's brain, we're going to make really sort of bizarre connections and associations about the trauma because we don't have the mental capacity to make wiser decisions. A simple example, if a 4-year-old is bit by a dog, you wouldn't be surprised if that 4-year-old makes a decision because of the pain, that their brain makes a decision that I'm going to stay away from dogs the rest of my life. Because they don't have, a 4-year-old doesn't have the capacity to realize that was just this dog in this circumstance. That's why this dog bit me. Because they can't process that data. If they were 8, they might realize, oh, that happened because I got in the dog's face, or this dog, the parents told me this dog's just cranky or old or is in pain. And it doesn't mean I have to be afraid of all dogs because I can understand the circumstances. That's just the difference between an older brain and a younger brain. So when we get into why trauma has such profound effects, one of the reasons is because if we're left to our own devices, we're left to wherever we are developmentally in terms of trying to make sense of that suffering. And we still come to conclusions, but they're the conclusions of a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 10-year-old, and the best that that age brain can come up with to try to make sense and figure out how to prevent that from happening again. Which is why things like phobias for children, much more common as a defense mechanism. Yeah.
That upward arrow is just gonna go ahead and happen with that brain. It's not like there's years of, the brain doesn't like stop in the middle because the brain isn't developed enough to do the reasoning. It just does the reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, well, the point here is because trauma and the memory records that this is unpleasant, this hurts, this is disturbing. And it affects, in many cases, because trauma is often associated with the relationships, if it's in a relationship that we trust and that relationship has suddenly gotten unsafe, then we've got a crisis here as well that we don't know how to make sense of. And this is part of where therapy or having someone help us make sense later, as we begin to look through someone's story, you can begin, in the context of relationship, you can begin to heal some of the shock and impact of the trauma and the impact on beliefs and feelings about relationships. But yeah, lots of people have trauma and they have no cognitive memory of it. The memory is down here, but because, I mean, most of us, I have very few memories under age 5. That doesn't mean I actually lived with a foster family for my first year of living, which should have been a pretty significant trauma. I have no record of that, but I can only assume something was thrown off in me, and because I have insecure attachment style, that's probably the beginning of that for me. But I have no memory of it, and that therapy would not help other than theoretically, other than looking at where do I have trouble attaching now. But other people have much more specific kinds of memories or attachment associations with trauma that they've been through. This is from The Body Keeps the Score. There's a whole bunch of things worth quoting in that book. This is sort of the Bible of trauma. It came out about in 2012, I think. This is the part I really want you to focus on. This is our instinct. How do I go on living with what's happened? I have to do something with this trauma. I've got to put it somewhere. I don't know how to resolve it, so I've got to put it somewhere. And his point is, it takes tremendous energy to continue functioning as if nothing happened, because so much of the energy is devoted towards not facing the ramifications of the trauma or the effect of the trauma. So it's important when we're talking about trauma to have some sense of how complicated this is on one level. This is another quote from the book, also helpful. The point that van der Kolk is making in this book is that particularly significant trauma changes the way our brain actually is wired. Because now our brain has to adapt to the reality and the possibility of more trauma. So our system gets stuck in a hyper alert, some degree of hyper alert state. The arousal system is sort of kicked on. It's like having, when your house gets broken into and then you get an alarm system. If it gets broken in again, you get more alarm systems because you're trying to prevent the thing from happening again. And so a lot of energy is spent on how do I control this from happening again? And that begins to inhibit one's ability to actually enter into life freely or spontaneously or experience life in a way that you want to experience life. And Annie's going to talk a little bit about this in a minute or two. About in PTSD, the body continues to defend against a threat that is in the past. And that's partly because the brain doesn't have the ability to discern time frames. Lots of examples in the book about this. All of this research began with studying combat vets and why they were still reacting to cues from combat, even 40 years later. Why they still had traumatic responses, instinctive responses, if they heard loud noises or if something caught them off guard. My mentor in college was a bomber pilot in World War II and was shot down and was a prisoner of war. And when I was going to their house, he was the Young Life Committee member and like a father to me. When I went to their house, I realized that he and his wife slept in twin beds. And at one point I knew him well enough to go, Mel, why do you guys sleep in twin beds? And he goes, he chuckled, and he said, because of my nightmares. And he said, one time Ruth tried to wake me up because I was screaming, and I slugged her because he was having flashbacks to the prisoner of war experience. So for her own safety, she's got her own bed. That was the story. And I had no idea. I was just sort of like stunned by that and thinking, I didn't like, how can you have memories that are that dramatic or that intense? One more comment from here, and this is important with where we'll go toward the end. It does make a difference when traumatic events are happening if a person or a child has some way to consciously protect themselves or is able to do something in the midst of the trauma. If the opposite of this is feeling trapped, feeling stuck, feeling like I have no way to deal with this, no way to cope with this, no one to turn to, nothing my brain can think of nothing to do except endure this. And in that case, all of that need to try to lessen the scars then generates internal effort to protect oneself and do something about the trauma. All right, Annie?
Hopefully by the end of this 15 minutes, we'll have a better understanding why. Here's 2 clients. One, she was 11 or 12. Her softball coach had her go with him to go get the team's uniforms. So she was feeling like, yeah, I get to go with the coach. And he goes in the shed, gets out the uniforms, has her try on the shirt. In the middle of trying on the shirt to make sure that she could help with the sizes, he fondles her. Okay, he fondles her pretty extensively. After that happened, she left. She reported it. I mean, it was the good of the story, as you know. Of course, this was she wasn't the only one, and he's still in prison today. Okay. She's relatively, she's married. She's relatively well adjusted compared to a client who, like in 7th grade, didn't have a whole lot of resources at home, didn't have a whole lot of exposure and experience to like curling irons and hairbrushes and makeup. And she goes to camp and her friends curl her hair and she goes out to look at herself. And instead of a softball coach, it's a gym teacher. And he goes, hey, and she's all excited. Why don't you try to grow some hair before you curl it? That girl waited another 12, 13, 14 years to ever put something in her hair again. So one was a really awful comment that had devastating effects. One was a big T trauma that she seemed to be, less affected by. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll have a better sense of how come. Okay, so trauma, 2 assumptions. One, we're created to live in paradise where everything works and everything's given to us. So Adam and Eve were in the garden pre-sin, and they went freely. They didn't have a need for anything. Their gender was different, but it worked, right? And then sin happened, and they were kicked out of the garden. So if you can follow those assumptions and think, okay, well, we're created in the garden. We're in the womb. We're constantly held. We're constantly fed. And we're really warm. We're at the perfect temperature, right? We get kicked out of paradise when we go through the birth canal and we scream because now all of a sudden we are supposed to have, where we went from a world where we had all our needs met and it worked, and we came out into a world where It didn't work, and we've got to figure out how to get our needs met. All right, so we cry and we find out, and as our awareness expands, as our world gets better, we get better at figuring out how to get our needs met, right? Those are our two assumptions. Traumas happen, that's here, okay? There's a lot of talk if you're listening to podcasts or, TikTok or whatever. There's a whole, the field shifted about 15, 20 years ago and started to look at environmental trauma, and they're calling it complex trauma, right? So you have the world of trauma is big, but it's kind of divided into two sections. There's trauma, where there's a clear before and after. Life was like this happened, then life was like that. Okay? Something usually you can point to. Sometimes you can't point to. It's pre-memory, but you had a feeling of freedom and safety. And then somewhere around, I don't know, 4th grade, life didn't work anymore, right? So it's either memory or not memory, but there's a clear something happened and your world changed, all right? Healing from trauma, that kind of trauma, looks at, well, what happened? And then how did you handle what happened? All right. In the world of that type of trauma, there's big T trauma, assaults, all kinds of assaults. There's little T traumas, right? Here's where it gets tricky in the trauma world. It's so funny when, like Bill said, have you experienced trauma in your lifetime? And I'm like, well, good luck not have it. In this definition, yes, we all have. We're just going to assume yes. We have not all had big T trauma. We have all not had sexual abuse. That's a big T trauma. Every single one of us has had little T trauma, which you flip it, abuse of sexuality, where our gender didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe as a woman. I didn't feel safe as a man. We would put that gym teacher in a small T trauma, right? That small T trauma had an effect on that client's sense of femininity and sexuality, but it had devastating effects. The softball coach was big T trauma. She could point to it. There was a before and after. She had trust issues, but she was relatively well adjusted in her adult life. Okay. Little T traumas are sometimes we actually don't get to say what they are. So I have an 8-year-old who we moved into. I have 3 kids, 2 older twins that are 5 years older than her, and that's significant because when they were 13 or 14, in the world that we were living in Loudoun County, something that went viral was there was going to be killer clowns at the school. My little 8-year-old didn't know that. We protected her from that, but she's around and she can hear conversation and she can hear about the killer clowns, right? We move into a new neighborhood. I go she goes and finds, we're so happy, like around the corner and down the street, there's these kids that she's playing with. I go to the store and I come back and I already know something happened, the world changed. What happened was she was around the corner and a 15-year-old dressed up like a killer clown had a fake machete and ran down the street after them. She was with 2 other people. One of them was so scared that they slept with their parents that night. One of them was so scared he went and got his Nerf gun and was going to go kill the clown. My daughter was so scared she didn't sleep for a day and a half. She became less than an infant. We couldn't leave her. She bought it. Her brain bought it hook, line, and sinker. What we can deduce is that she had heard it and we didn't know it. And so when that killer clown, she really thought she was going to die. She didn't go to school for 10 days. When I saw the parents of the kid, I asked them, hey, it might help her to see your son without and they got really defensive. And they said, well, that's not trauma. I know what trauma is. That's not trauma. And at that point, I realized actually we don't get to know we don't get to say what's trauma. All three of those kids experienced it wasn't trauma for the guy with the Nerf gun. It was an adventure. It was fear. Trauma happens when your fight, flight, or freeze gets activated. And so we could experience the same event. One of us might be traumatized. One of us might, like, we don't get to say, our bodies tell us what it is, right? Because then it shows up. When that fight, flight, or freeze gets activated, there's an imprint inside of you. And then it's going to be like a landmine that gets triggered somewhere around. And boy, did she get triggered. We didn't get in front of it. You know, the next Halloween, you know, we had to protect her from clowns. But she was so smart. And she ran home thinking she saw the clown. And then, like, the day later, she was, Mommy, do you think I actually saw the clown? Or do you think my brain saw the clown? And what we realized is it was the red leaves. Like that whole red thing around Halloween time would trigger her. That's trauma. Over here, there's complex trauma. Complex trauma is long-term. It's pervasive. And it's typically at the hands of the folks that are supposed to keep you safe. Complex trauma, a lot of times there's no before and after, it just always was. So when you're sitting with people and you think, well, can you think of it? And when they say, well, actually, no. Okay. Complex trauma, I'm really comfortable with. I will go on record to say all of us have experienced complex trauma, but it's in a continuum. All right. And the best way to say that is if we pick an arbitrary number of like 10 characteristics, like if I get born with 10 characteristics, Tay gets born with 10 characteristics, Kyle gets 10 characteristics, we're going to come on the scene into our little world called the family. And probably the best families in the world, there's going to have time for 7 or 8 of your characteristics to come out. So there's not a room for all of us to be all 10 of our, like, who God designed us to be. There's not time, there's not room, you know. If you have more than one kid, if you have 3 like mine, and I talk with a lot of parents where I'm like, do you have one kid where the road trip would work a lot better if they weren't there? Well, because their characteristics don't match the flow of the family. And I have one like that. It's really, you have to work really hard not to say that they're wrong, because they're not wrong. They just happen to be born with the characteristics that don't match with the bulk of us, right? And we have to make sure that there's room for her, right? So in most families, there's not if all my 10 come out and it's safe, and all 10 of my husbands and all 10 of all 3 of my kids, we're not going to get anything done. There's not time, right? There's a continuum, though. So when you have then a family like ours, I wouldn't say that. I would say our older kids experienced a whole lot different of a home than my younger kid. There's 5.5 years difference. And I would contend she would probably be in the 7 to 8. There's room for a lot of her characteristics, not my older kids. The way I explain it is, like, if parenting, you know, like, people use there's guardrails and we're supposed to be able to bump into them. But if you picture like a bowling alley and you have bumpers, so your little kids can have a ball and they can roll it down. Well, the great thing about those bumpers is they can slam into the bumper, and they're going to eventually make it down the alley. They're not going to go in the gutter, right? My 2 twins were so different. One of them came out slamming into the bumpers. And so we would try to bring her back into the middle with all the best that we could. Her sister wasn't born with that temperament. She's more of an other-centered. And she's looking at it going, oh, I don't want that. Like, I'm just going to keep myself straight down the middle. All right. So there wasn't a whole lot of room for her to find out, like, well, who am I? How did God create me? Because a lot of her didn't get to come out because there's a lot of tension in the home. We allowed her sister to take up more space because it looked like she required a lot more space when in reality she didn't. We just didn't. We went to the path of least resistance. Oh, this daughter's fine. This daughter, when they had trying to put them to sleep, one of the daughters didn't like to go to sleep. She's probably, it was actually Bill's son that helped me when he was listening to the differences. He's like, gosh, you spent a lot of time talking about how hard this one is, but isn't she like the more normal one? I was like, what? He's like, but yeah, kids don't like to go to sleep. Kids do push back. Kids do argue. Maybe your other one that made life easy, maybe she's the different one. That was helpful. But at 3 years old, when I go in and I see the one that's responsible changing her own pull-up, I can deduce, and she would agree, I don't think it even occurred to her to yell to help. Mommy, I'm wet. She didn't want to disturb, she didn't want what mommy and daddy are doing with her sister to happen. Oh, and my temperament, I can organize and I'm responsible and I get a lot of, like, I have a lot of autonomy, right? So part of her loved that she can pull her own pull up, right? But part of her didn't know that she could ask for help, scream for help, be messy, right? So that's a continuum of, I would say that that's like if you take this arbitrary 10 characteristics, we would have been a family that we would say, oh, we're kind of in the middle, right? Then you have the continuum where there's abuse, right? You're going to meet people, there are people in this room that grew up in abusive and in neglectful homes. By definition, if you have abuse in your home, that is complex trauma. They're going to be together. We have complex trauma in our house. We're not abusive. All right. If you look at the 2 clients that I gave you at the beginning, one had a very low amount of complex trauma. There was a lot of safety. This client with the softball coach could bring her full self to her family. She could bump into the bumpers. Negative emotions were okay. She got a lot of help. So when she had big T sexual trauma, it was tough and it was hard, but it wasn't as tough as this other client that had a tremendous amount of abuse and neglect in her home. And she couldn't if the second client had been able to go home and go, hey, Mom, this is what the gym teacher said to me. He did? No. Let's go get you a curling iron. You can curl your hair with short hair. The effects wouldn't have been that client waited until she was 22, 23 to put something in her hair again, right? So complex trauma, it matters because they did studies back in the 80s and 90s, like big T trauma was, a lot of people got help, kind of. But if they don't look at the complex, like the environment that grew up, they're only gonna heal so much. I have one of my most rewarding clients, and I'll end with this. He has a tremendous amount of both. He came into the office and I would call it, his diagnosis would be called full-blown monkey tilt. And he was like, right? And what triggered him was his wife got nervous about their money and she didn't feel safe talking to him about it. And he came in, he's like, I'm not scary. Like he's just yelling, like, why is she afraid of me? He grew up in a home where his dad was an alcoholic and he was abusive. And actually, a couple months ago, his mom let him know, named it, "Your father never liked you." His father, and I would say couldn't like him. He was the only son, my client's the only son of a family with 3 daughters and him. His dad made his way in the world. His dad was really smart and he became a lawyer. My client is severely dyslexic and it's his only son, right? Severely dyslexic. So dad gets triggered. Gosh, where do we go here? Like, his dad gets triggered because if his way of solving his own trauma, if he got out of his own childhood trauma by being smart and making it in the world, and then his one son is not smart, it's triggering his trauma. So he can't, liking his son is not an option. He basically told his son that he couldn't even be a taxi driver because he can't read a map. Right? There's so much complex trauma. There was childhood sexual abuse. The mom didn't like it. She admitted to him, she used to take the sisters, they used to trick him, and she'd take them all to the pool and leave him home by himself. And she said, "Yeah, I actually think I let your dad beat you because if he beat you, he wouldn't beat me." Right? All the way up to the point where this client, at 16, he was on his way to kill himself, to jump off of a bridge in McLean over here. So that was his only out. What saved him was he looked and his father used to drop him off to fish on the side of the bridge and he saw it. He said he wouldn't even go, he wouldn't go to a drop off or it would be in the middle and he'd go. And he'd go out with his fishing pole and he would go down and he said he would fish with immigrants. And he would give the immigrants his fish and they would teach him different fishing techniques. And he went to go look at the bridge, jump off the bridge, and he's like, "Oh, wait, I could go live there. I have a tent and I have a fishing rod." Like he found an out. I don't have to die here. I can go live there. So what do you think happens when his wife is afraid about provision? If providing for himself saved his life from jumping off of a bridge, he gets triggered. His wife can't be afraid about finances because it flicks the very thing that saved his life. Do you see that? Does that make sense? So trauma it's a big thing. We've all been through it. We've all been through little t trauma because we know we have. We have this internal sense. God created us in his image. So his image lives inside of us. So we know how what world should be. But we also have depravity. We don't experience that. And there's a conflict, right? But complex trauma is the only way we wouldn't have complex trauma is if we stayed in the garden. I'll end here. What complex trauma, it doesn't look at what happened and therefore how you handled it. What it looks at is what was it like being you and how did you adapt to your environment? And it looks at the healing is really cool and fun because what it looks at is what parts of your character are dormant and haven't seen the light of day because you adapted to stay safe. And so you're protected, but there's lots of your character that haven't gotten the healing they need. So it looks like adaptation. And it goes on, you go on a process of discovery.
Yeah, I'm just going to close because we're out of time, but I do want to end with what I started with. What's required to be helpful to someone who either has to face trauma because they're triggered, because they're in crisis, or they're coming to counseling because they know that the stories of suffering are affecting the quality of their life now. Like I know I'm not experiencing life or intimacy or joy or even spiritual because of what happened to me. And all I'm saying is, all I really want to say is that if you have the privilege of coming alongside someone, and Annie was trying to address this, the whole field of trauma work has changed from trying to free people from their unhealthy responses, their defense mechanisms, their self-protection, which becomes maladaptive as an adult, to having more understanding and grace for how they've actually coped with trauma and how to help them begin to change, recognize how well they've taken care of themselves, and begin to strengthen the parts of them that have not had a chance, the better parts of them, or the truer parts of them that haven't really had a chance to be up on the main floor. That you'll see in complex trauma, the image we had come up with is often your best self gets locked in a bomb shelter in the basement because it's not safe to be your true self in a traumatic environment. And the work with trauma, particularly with complex trauma, is how do you control all of the adaptive features and personalities and tactics that we have in order to let something, a better version of ourselves, and the part that can really respond more richly to the Holy Spirit, how does that part, like the client she was describing, is now very different because of the work that they've been doing, and now has a much richer experience and more control over his reactivity. Part of how you know it's working is that they're less easily triggered, or the triggers don't last as long, or they now have the cerebral cortex ability to actually talk themselves through the triggering and the emotional reactions. But you don't get there without that, the story being understood and embraced and valued in a sense, instead of fixed. So
And if you think about the bomb shelter, what you put in a bomb shelter is the goal. You protect ownership. So you go on to the discovery of like there's gold.
Yeah.
That you're buried. It's your most precious, vulnerable parts that get locked down in that bomb shelter. And they needed to go there for safety.
Last thing I want to say, Allender in his Healing the Wounded Heart, certainly better than van der Kolk, who's just doing research on trauma, has powerful stories. Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry's book, What Happened to You, also an excellent book on trauma, on understanding trauma from a neuroscience basis. But Allender's book is the one that's trying to tie in trauma with the story of God, with the work of God. And if you know anything about Allender, he spent most of his life working with trauma victims. And his first version of The Wounded Heart was a book that most of my clients who were reading it hated, because he was trying to explain that the way you've coped with being traumatized is by being defensive and having a difficult style of relating and that sort of thing. And people would get mad because he was exposing them, but also challenging them with their that the way they've chosen to protect themselves made it difficult for people to get close to them or trust them, or for relationships to work and that sort of thing. 25 years later, he's much kinder in his approach and much more appreciative of how you go into a story. You go into it much more gently, much more supportively, much more willing to, like they say in Young Life, win the right to be heard. But he does say in both books, what he's saying is, eventually, as someone begins to wrestle with the God questions and look at what happened to me, you begin to see that God has been writing a story here, a calling, a purpose that gets revealed through the work of looking at the negative things that have happened in your life. The part of what God calls us to is a very sort of much more sophisticated or rich version of, as you've been comforted, so comfort others. But it's also an indication that the place in the kingdom of God that he may have us is based on, in part, on what happened to us. And if we get to the other side of that, to where we have more freedom inside, then we begin to see the genius of God allowing things to happen to us. That until then, we're going to be angry, judgmental, or terrified of God because he doesn't protect us like he said he would. So let me close this in prayer. I know we've run over. Father, thank you for your faithfulness. And I just pray that as people just consider these ideas, that your Spirit would begin to help them see something that is helpful in their life and in the ministries you've called them to. Bring us back safely in 2 weeks, and we pray for the groups as they meet again next week. And thank you in Christ's name. Amen.